And during COP26, we have announced over £140 million of adaptation support to African countries. Finally, I am privileged to announce today new UK support of £274 million for the Climate Action for a Resilient Asia programme. This will empower and equip 14 million people with the means to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I trust that through this dialogue today, we can rapidly accelerate adaptation at a global scale and, importantly, learn from each other. It is our responsibility to build a climate-resilient future for all. Glasgow is a moment to build a movement, because we can't afford to fail. Our time is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for remembering we need to build a movement, we need everybody on board, and also we need the financing to flow. So thank you for your significant contribution to Asia indeed. So the way we're going to run this meeting today, first we have a hard stop. 1 p.m. is the hard stop, which we're going to abide to, 1. Secondly, we have 3 themes: ambition, financing, partnership, and ministers will speak to these 3 themes. And thirdly, we have framing speakers introducing these themes, after which then the ministers will respond to it. I know all ministers have very long speeches prepared by their teams, and Canada is nodding, no, is ignoring. So what I would like to urge all of you, we know the adaptation imperative is there. Focus on the what and the how, not on the problem side, but on the solution side. So let me now first go to one of the framing speakers, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, also the chairman of the Global Center on Adaptation, and a strong advocate on adaptation action indeed. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what happens at COP26 could not be more important, because the reality is we have been failing. We have been failing the world, and we have been failing the most vulnerable communities living on the front lines. If we do not take the necessary steps to cut carbon emissions and adapt to the realities of our changing climate, the future could not be more bleak. Yet the response by governments around the world to the COVID-19 pandemic has shown what is possible when we face imminent peril. We must harness this same drive today in our response to existential climate threats. We cannot continue with business as usual. The most vulnerable are already bearing the brunt of our accelerating climate crisis. It is time for a change, and we all have a responsibility to make it happen. Young people are accusing us of not acting with a sense of urgency the climate emergency requires. We must show them we understand there can be no more hollow promises, and that we understand the opportunity there is to transform our world to a sustainable and resilient future, to allow countries to move from climate vulnerability to climate prosperity. Because adaptation is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. $1 spent on climate resilience can see returns on investment of 20 to 1. This is why I'm pleased to see the United Kingdom has made adaptation a priority for this COP26, and that over 30 countries have now submitted adaptation communications or national adaptation plans representing more than 2 billion people, helping to share best practice and mobilize action. But a step change is needed to address the gaps in ambition, on mitigation, on adaptation, and on finance. to support the delivery of the Paris Climate Change Agreement goals. As the only international organization dedicated entirely to accelerating adaptation action, the Global Center on Adaptation, GCA, with Dr. Verkoyen at the helm, is ready to play its part in this transformation. To urgently accelerate climate action and ensure finance is flowing to support this transition, especially for the poorest and the most vulnerable. There is no time to waste. Thank you for your commitment and leadership.
Thank you so much, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, for your strong words of guidance. Let's move to the next speaker, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Muhammad. We all know her, we all love her. She has been a very strong advocate on adaptation, particularly also for Africa, and also calling for this 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation finance. So let's listen to Amina. Thank you.
Around the world, people are struggling with climate change. The signs are all around us: floods, droughts, heat, and catastrophic storms. The human toll is devastating: lost lives and livelihoods, displacement and migration, and young people losing hope in the future. And the burden will fall disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable, who contributed least to this problem. As we decrease emissions, we must also increase ambition on adaptation. All countries, but especially developing ones, need to support to build climate-resilient and green economies. The Adaptation Finance Gap is considerable. The latest OECD report shows that just over $20 billion, about 25% of total climate finance, goes to adaptation. This is a fraction of the expected $300 billion needed by 2030. That's why the Secretary General continues to call on all donors to allocate at least 50% of their climate finance to adaptation. Multilateral development banks should start as soon as possible. Support for adaptation and resilience not only saves lives and livelihoods, it can also help countries recover from COVID-19 by investing in green jobs and infrastructure. Step by step, we are moving towards a more resilient future and the implementation of the SDGs. But we must do more. We must accelerate and scale up solutions like these. And that's what this meeting is all about. I look forward to hearing the results of your discussion. Let's continue joining forces to boost adaptation finance and deliver the green economic transformation that humanity requires for our planet, for our children, and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina Muhammad, Deputy Secretary General, also reminding us this is a growth agenda, this is a jobs agenda, this is an opportunity agenda. But also, let's not be naive. Those who are suffering the most, as we said, are living in the global south, but also is the youth constituency. We already see massive impacts across the globe, but that will also increase over time. So let us hear from a youth voice, a message of urgency. Emily Dola, please.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are live streaming or seeing from. Thanks so much for being here, and I really mean that because I think that throughout the last week, all of us has been hearing a lot of frustration, a lot of protests about how action on adaptation and loss and damage is moving really slow. However, I just came from the first meeting for the presidency, which was on frontline communities, and I realized that we can still win this race, we can still do this, but it really depends on how fast can we mobilize funding and resources for adaptation action led by local groups on the ground and by local governments, which isn't getting there fast enough. I also realized that we really need to make sure that we break through to some negotiation items, particularly around how to better operationalize Santiago network for loss and damage, as well as how to better support countries to develop national adaptation plans and communications. This includes support from finance and resources, but we must be careful with climate finance. We really want to advocate for more climate finance be given in the forms of grants and not simply in the forms of loan. Since economic equity is really important for the adaptive capacity of countries, and that has been highlighted in reports by the IPCC as well. More last but not least, we want all countries and ministers to consider that when they're thinking about vulnerability to climate adaptation and to loss and damage, they might look at communities as like diverse members in which some groups are more affected by the impacts of climate change than others, from women and girls to disabled people to the elderly through young people. That means that any adaptation plans must be responsive to these differences around social marginalization and discrimination. They must consider this. And also, at the same time, we know that nature has been a really big theme in this COP. And so we really hope that when countries and ministers across all departments are planning for development and energy infrastructure plans, they consider how those might affect nature and in turn might lead to like less adaptive capacity across their own countries. So please do keep that in mind when you take back to your countries and try to take all these words we are speaking here to plan some action happening on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily, also for being so forward-leaning and calling upon all of us to be bold. Speaking about boldness, I would like now to invite a very good friend, my brother, President Adesina of the African Development Bank. Last week, you launched this Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, and together we also brought forward an Africa Adaptation Youth Council, so that the voice of Emily and all the other Emilys in the world will not only be listened to, but also be used as an agent of change. President Adesina.
Thank you very much, my dear brother Patrick, and thanks for your global leadership on this crucially important issue of adaptation. Excellencies, honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is having devastating effects in Africa. Droughts, floods, and climate-induced local swarms are devastating farmlands and increasing food insecurity and destroying livelihoods of smallholder farmers, majority of whom are women. Africa loses $7 billion to $15 billion a year to climate change, and this could rise to $50 billion a year by 2040. Let's have no doubt about it. Climate adaptation is Africa's main priority. Yet Africa has very little resources to adapt to climate change, as it receives only 3% of global climate finance. But we are not deterred. The African Development Bank is taking the lead in tackling Africa's climate challenges. We will double our climate finance to $25 billion by 2025, and that will make 40% of our total investments in climate. I'm very pleased that the African Development Bank is the only multilateral development bank to have achieved and exceeded parity for adaptation. We surpassed 50-50 parity between adaptation and mitigation in 2018, and we reached 55% and 63% for climate adaptation in 2019 and 2020, respectively. We are greatly honored by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres' endorsement of the bank's leadership on climate adaptation in his speech to United Nations General Assembly. We have raised our ambition even further, together with Patrick and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. Our goal is to raise $25 billion for adaptation. It's the largest, the boldest, and the most transformative climate adaptation ever put forward for Africa. The African Development Bank has committed $12.5 billion of this amount, and we look forward to develop partner countries to help us to deliver on the $12.5 billion balance. This support will have amazing impacts. It will deliver climate advisory services to 30 million farmers and pastoralists. It will support 1 million youth and unlock $3 billion in financing for them. At Cop26, just last week Friday, Patrick and I unveiled a $1 million prize for Youth Adapt that was awarded to 10 businesses run by young people on climate adaptation in Africa. And 70% of the winners are women. That's very good, because when women win, Africa wins. To build the voices of young people into Africa's climate adaptation, the African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation is announcing the launch of the African Youth Climate Council. The Council will amplify the voices, the ideas, the innovations, and the businesses of young people on climate in Africa. It will help to increase adaptation finance to over $5 billion a year, including from the private sector. We're already delivering massive impacts for the most vulnerable that Amina, my dear sister, talked about, who are actually the smallholder farmers of Africa. The African Development Bank's Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, we call it TAAT, has provided 11 million farmers in 29 countries with climate-resilient agricultural technologies, all that in just 2 years. This includes heat-tolerant wheat varieties on 1.8 million hectares in Ethiopia, Sudan, and 6 other countries, areas warming from climate change. And it has supported 5.2 million households now growing drought-tolerant maize on 840,000 hectares in Southern Africa. To support and deliver support for climate adaptation at scale for farmers and to feed Africa in the face of climate change, African heads of state and global leaders agreed to create what's called the Financing Facility for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa. This facility will work within the framework of the African Adaptation Acceleration Program with the aim of raising $1 billion to allow African agriculture to adapt to climate change. The facility will deliver climate-resilient technologies for 40 million farmers and produce an additional 100 million metric tons of food. This will be enough to feed 200 million people and reduce hunger in Africa by 80%. As I close, let me say, the facility's vision can be summarized in our action slogan, 1 for 200, meaning $1 billion to feed 200 million Africans. The African Adaptation Acceleration Program is Africa's bold solution to climate adaptation. Let's show our support for Africa by providing the $12.5 billion needed to meet the financing target for the program. Goodwill, equity, trust, and support are critical. Let's deliver that for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Akin, for your strong words and also for reminding all of us of your 3 agenda items: action, action, action indeed, and putting women at the center. The next speaker is really speaking to that agenda and approach straightforward. Mari Pugenstu, World Bank Managing Director. The World Bank has been in the adaptation finance arena for many, many years. It was the first one who announced in Katowice a few years ago the 50-50 split. Madam, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Emily and all the youth that you represent, good day. Thank you, Secretary Ban Ki-moon and the Global Center on Adaptation for the opportunity to join you today to put a spotlight on the adaptation agenda. On this 8th day of the COP, Adaptation Day, it's an important moment for our shared commitment to building resilience in climate-vulnerable communities, especially women who are most affected around the globe. We know why. Climate change could push 132 million more people into extreme poverty by 2030. 216 million people will also have to suffer from internal migration across all regions because of emerging hotspots. This is why climate finance that drives more ambitious and adaptation action on the ground is at the heart of our climate and development work. In 2020, the World Bank Adaptation Finance amounted to $9 billion. Also in 2020, the World Bank accounted for over half of multilateral climate finance to developing countries and over 2/3 of adaptation finance. A lot of that goes to IDA, our poorest countries, with grants as well as very concessional terms. This translates into tangible outcomes that benefit people. For example, in Ethiopia, about 900,000 hectares of land is now being sustainably managed, benefiting some 2.5 million people. This work has led to better water access, less soil erosion, improved food security, higher yields, and diversified sources of income, resulting in more resilient livelihoods. A more interesting example is what we call the green fiscal stimulus, which has the triple wins. Programs, cash for work programs that restore degradation in landscapes and seascapes in various countries, in various of our client countries, achieve a triple win. It creates cash for work for the communities that are being affected by the pandemic, and at the same time, as they restore the land or the seascapes, they're improving their livelihoods and lives in the future, and also, obviously, contributing hugely to adaptation and resilience. But it will take more to deliver real change, as all of you have said. Unlocking private finance for adaptation is essential to growing investment in resilience over the next decade. We have a key role to play in this endeavor. Another example is in Angola, a World Bank guarantee mobilized over 900 million from international commercial lenders to improve access to potable water service, reducing the population's exposure to climate-related shocks and water scarcity. That's an example of public-private partnership. And at the national level, the bank has made concerted efforts to help countries develop and implement financial protection strategies against climate shocks and help countries respond and recover more quickly to disasters. The Adaptation Forward Development approach is rooted in our new Climate Action Plan, which is a guide for our climate lending. 35% of our financing will go for climate, and half of that will go to adaptation. And we are contributing a quarter of this 100 billion that everybody is talking about. And on youth, I just wanted to mention, we have a Youth for Climate program in the bank. They recently created a Connect for Climate Youth program at the pre-COP summit in Milan, and I encourage all youth to also participate in that. We are a committed partner to this GCA and this ministerial dialogue platform as a means to reach our shared goal of global adaptation action that reduces the vulnerability of the millions of people in developing countries. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, also reminding us that it is also about access to finance and unleashing the firepower of the private sector indeed. So we heard from framing speakers, global leaders setting the scene. This is a ministerial dialogue, so let's now turn the table and hear from the ministers. It's going to be a little bit of a dance. I would like to invite a set of ministers, the first set, to come to the stage, sit here, and then you make your remarks from the lectern. So the following countries, please. Canada, Denmark, France, Costa Rica, Ghana, and the Netherlands. So when honourable ministers are taking the seat, it gives me also the time to introduce our next speaker, who has just been appointed in his job as the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. Stephen Gilbert, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Merci beaucoup. C'est un honneur de m'adresser à vous aujourd'hui. Last week, Prime Minister Trudeau referred to a town in Canada that was obliterated by wildfires earlier this year. Every country here has a community like Lytton, drowned or burned or blown away by some freak weather event that has somehow started to become routine. Climate change is happening, it's here. We must adapt. It's one of the key themes of Cop26, and we are committed to doing our part. In Canada, like elsewhere across the world, climate change is disproportionately impacting those who are the most vulnerable. 4 of every 5 people displaced by changing climate are women. Earlier this year, we doubled our pledge for international climate finance over 5 years. From that, we've also committed to put at least 40% of our $5.3 billion toward climate adaptation. Le Premier ministre Trudeau a cité 3 initiatives ciblées de financement de l'adaptation lors de la COP26. First, Canada is re-upping with $37.5 million over 5 years to the Least Developed Countries Fund to help some of the most vulnerable communities adapt. Second, Canada will make its first ever contribution of up to $10 million to the Adaptation Fund. And third, Canada will provide up to $10 million for the National Adaptation Program Global Network. But we cannot talk about fighting climate change and adapting to its impact without talking about nature. This we know in Canada. Nature stores carbon. It both takes the brunt of climate change impact and buffers us from the worst of it. C'est pourquoi le Canada s'est engagé cette semaine à consacrer au moins $1 milliard à des solutions fondées sur la nature et axées sur la protection de la biodiversité dans les pays en voie de développement au cours des 5 prochaines années. This is my 19th COP. I attended the first one in Berlin as a wide-eyed activist. I'm still an optimist because I know that we, the people here at Cop26, have it within us to ensure adaptation action reaches those on the planet who need it the most. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Stephen, also for your government being so determined to drive adaptation action globally. Let's move to the next speaker, Minister for Development and Nordic Cooperation in Denmark, Flemming Møller Mortensen, also chair of a board member of the GCA.
Thank you very much. Climate change is really the defining challenge of our time. The consequences are already disrupting food production and water supply. Coastal zones and cities are threatened, in particular Africa and small island states. The people who are hit the hardest often have the fewest resources to adapt to the consequences. Therefore, it is key that the developed countries collectively raise our climate finance. Denmark will walk the talk to the benefit of the poorest and most vulnerable countries and people. By 2023, we aim to deliver more than half a billion US dollars annually in the grant-based financing for climate action. On top of that, Denmark will continue to mobilize climate finance from other sources, including private investments. In total, we expect to contribute at least 1% of the collective target of $100 billion. On top of that, I have just launched a pilot scheme with state guarantees. A scheme has the potential to mobilize an additional $450 to $600 million US dollars in the pilot phase. Climate change adaptation is a necessity. Floods, droughts, and cyclones are becoming more frequent. Poor people, crops, livestock, and houses are threatened. This is why developing countries, as well as UN Secretary General Guterres, call for increasing financing for climate change's adaptation. The Danish government is stepping up. We will dedicate at least 60% of our grant-based climate finances to adaptation. We also need to link implementations of adaptation action with inclusion and equality to ensure that we prioritize vulnerable communities, women, and employment creation, not least for young people. We must step up our efforts to assist people in the front line of climate, included catastrophes and devastating weather events. Let's all raise our financing. We need all hands on deck. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, also for your government stepping up the share of adaptation finance, in particular also the grant finance component to it. Very much appreciated indeed. And thank you for your big announcement on this today. Let's move to another part of the world, Central America, Costa Rica. We have with us a bold minister, a very forward-leaning minister, who basically is sort of the adaptation champion, not only at home, but for the whole world. Andrea Mesa, please.
Thank you, Patrick, Excellencies, and thank you for the invitation. This is a very important date in the COP. We're talking about the adaptation date. And it's so important because probably adaptation is the agenda that will allow us to really address inequality And we cannot solve the climate crisis if we don't address inequality. So this is a very central aspect, and for this reason, we really appreciate all the commitments that we are hearing, all the work. I see Minister Trevelyan here. Thank you for all your work and what you're doing, because it is critical to attend all the vulnerable regions. And let me share with you some specific data about Central America, which is also a very vulnerable region in the world. Central America has been hit by 2 hurricanes in 2020. First, Hurricane Eta, early November 2020, and then Hurricane Iota, just a couple of weeks after. Eta has been considered one of the worst weather-related disasters in the region in the last 2 decades, and it generated devastating impacts in infrastructures, in lives, and this is just to remind us that it is so critical to not leave any region behind. This is a call for that, to also consider every region when we are addressing and talking about adaptation. And we have the vehicles. We need to generate capacities. We have the national adaptation plans and the adaptation communications. We need to transform them into investment projects, and we need to continue to accelerate the mobilization of investments in infrastructure, in agriculture, and in those areas that are critical. Dry corridor in the region, and also remember that investing in nature is probably the wisest investment that we can do in a more cost-effective manner to generate resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Minister, reminding us, let's leave no region behind, and let's work with nature, not against it. Let's go to a different region indeed, Africa. We spoke about it quite a bit. President Adesina already introduced the adaptation imperative for Africa. Let's listen to the Minister from Environment of Ghana, Dr. Kukuhu. Please, you can speak from there. Yeah, speak from the left. Yes.
Thank you, Patrick. Excellencies, our protocol duly observed. On behalf of my President, as the President of the Republic of Ghana, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, I am pleased to address this high-level climate adaptation and loss and damage day at Cop26 here. It is important to note that all speakers have been harping on the point that the least emitters are the worst hit, and thus Africa continent. It's very unfortunate indeed, but what do we do? Less species, flora and fauna, have many times had a cost to adapt to new ecological niches. Now it is the time of mankind to adapt to a biophysical environment that has been so damaged by mankind himself. So we find ourselves here. Mr. Chairman, the major climate change impacts affect all sectors of Ghana's development. Ghana's vulnerability to climate change is in large part defined by its exposure to the various impacts, such as droughts, floods, and sea erosion. And it has become almost an annual event with great consequences on agriculture, energy production and distribution, water, forestry, among other sectors. However, we in Ghana are happy to partner Global Center on Adaptation, which has set a global adaptation agenda purposely to support vulnerable countries on adaptation. It is therefore first of its kind of global centers who believes and also have plans for implementation of adaptation actions of climate-vulnerable countries. As we speak now, GCA has 2 major studies in Ghana looking for opportunities for investment in nature-based and city infrastructures, and also planning to include Ghana in its adaptation education program. It is for your information that Ghana has a high priority in climate change education, as education tends to improve understanding and appreciation of climate change impacts on our communities and on our people as a whole. What we've learned from the IPCC's latest report is that Africa is warming faster than any continent of the world, and this comes with the loss and damage associated with climate change. In this respect, Ghana stands with the common positions of the African Group and Climate Vulnerable Forum that major emitters has to come with additional ambition in this COP26 to further reduce their emissions and support the 50-50 adaptation and mitigation balance. It is of great importance to the vulnerable climate change countries that this dream is realized. Additionally, because we are already living inside a worsening climate emergency, ambition raising must now encompass adaptation as a major priority. We have a battle on 2 fronts, and we need to constantly and also accelerate adaptation action to keep us safe. It is very disheartening to note that the global goal on adaptation, GCA, as per Article 7.1 of Paris Agreement, is still non-operational. And at this current negotiation rooms, African negotiators are finding it very difficult pushing this agenda through. And it goes to emphasize the fact that what has been said at the higher levels of commitment by our colleagues in the G20s and the developed countries are far different from what is happening in the negotiations rooms. It's very unfortunate and sad indeed. If we are to make progress to save the planet and to save the world, it is now. We from Ghana and Africa calls on the entire Committee of Nations to truly commit ourselves to the fight of climate change, adopting adaptation as a major ingredient and a major step. Thank you for your audience. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kokuvu. Also putting people at the center and investing in human capital indeed. Let's go to a different part of the world again. Let's come back to Europe. We have a very important minister with us today on ecological transition, who has also put forward last week very strong announcements on adaptation already by its President Macron. Barbara Pompili, please.
Thank you, Patrick. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very pleased to participate today to this dialogue. First of all, I want to stress that national adaptation plans are essential to deliver more ambition about adaptation. These plans allow countries to assess their adaptation needs before implementing the action needed. This assessment is also important to target the support we bring to other countries. For example, our National Development Agency, Oecd, has launched 2 initiatives, the 2050 Facility and Adaptation, to support our partners to design and implement low-carbon and climate-resilient strategies and to integrate them in public policies. Last week, the AFD announced a second phase of the Adaptation Facility, which will focus on support to adaptation planning and investments in Africa. This kind of intervention should be based on a holistic approach, having in mind that ecosystems conservation can enhance resilience. At the World Conservation Congress in Marseille, we promoted the role of nature-based solutions as a key solution to ensure the effectiveness and adequacy of adaptation measures. To be efficient, our actions should be supported financially, of course. That's why France will provide €6 billion annually between 2021 and 2025 to climate action, with 1/3 dedicated to adaptation. France will also make a contribution to the Least Developed Countries Fund and has already doubled its contribution to the Green Climate Fund. This must be completed, on one hand, with the reorientation of all finance flows toward a low-carbon and climate-resilient development, and, on the other hand, with a strong cooperation with multilateral development banks. And in this respect, I welcome the new Climate Change Action Plan of the World Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, Madam Minister, also for your continued commitment in increasing finance for adaptation now through your €2 billion a year, indeed. Let's stay in Europe. In fact, let's go to my home country, the Netherlands, who is also the host of the largest floating office in the world, which happens to be our headquarters. Mr. Minister De Bruin.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And let me first announce I'm happy that I just signed the declaration on phasing out state support for investments in fossil fuel. So I think that's very good news, and I hope other countries will join us. But, Chairman, that's not enough, even if it's good news. In addressing the climate crisis, we need to mobilize more climate finance and allocate more towards adaptation. Currently, just 1/5 of all climate finance is geared towards adaptation. Given the urgent needs and profound impacts already being felt worldwide, we need to ramp up investments in adapting to climate change. This is why we support the UN Secretary-General's call to allocate at least half of all public finance to adaptation and resilience. Actually, the Netherlands nearly devotes 2/3 of its public contribution. And in doing so, we focus on reaching the most climate vulnerable countries and communities and address their priorities. But it's not just about sheer amount. We must also improve the quality of adaptation finance, which should first and foremost be needs-based and contain a higher proportion of grants, avoiding further indebtedness of least developed countries. And next to improved quantity and quality, it's also critical to improve accessibility to finance, for example, for women and local communities. Chairman, we see crucial linkages between climate adaptation and the resilience of water and food systems. This is why the Netherlands will be co-hosting the United Nations 2023 Water Conference to accelerate global efforts to meet water-related challenges. The climate crisis is manifesting itself in water through drought and flooding, and sometimes even through pollution in cities, on farms, in nature and in households. Water is an important entry point for building climate resilience. At the recent Food Summit meeting in the General Assembly, national pathways were identified as means for food systems transformations. We need to think how these national pathways and NDCs can be mutually reinforcing and how to crowd in more private sector finance. Finally, to deliver adaptation progress at speed and scale, we should look to build partnerships that leverage knowledge, experience, and finance. The challenge is simply too great. We need to work together in partnership to drive the adaptation agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom, Honourable Minister, for a very bold statement, also remembering us that it's not just quantity, but it's also quality and access of finance indeed, and grant component needs to be an element to this. This also brings an end for this round of conversation. Let me also thank again all ministers here for their strong statements. I would like now to switch to the second bucket of topic which we will address, finance itself. So we have, again, framing speakers, then we will come to the minister on stage, and again, warm welcome and a thank you to the ministers. We will go back to their seats. It also allows me, knowing we are really rushed for time, and I want to accelerate this meeting in and of itself as well, to our next speaker. I think Andrea Messa indicated we need to think about all regions, not just the North or the South, but also, for example, the Caribbean. So I'm delighted to introduce John Leon, President of the Caribbean Development Bank. John, you're here? If John is not here, we do have Susan Morehead with us, the chair of the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. Susanna? Oh, here, sorry, I was too fast. I'm going too fast. John, great. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today I'd like to speak to 3 issues to frame this segment of the COVID discussion. First, the question is, how do we build confidence for the future? The international community has to fulfill its existing commitments to deliver on their US $100 billion per year commitment. Not only are we falling short, but we must rapidly work towards establishing a more ambitious climate finance target to take effect starting in 2025, especially because the world appears on track for reaching 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming, which would result in an intensification of the risks small island developing and vulnerable states are already confronting. With only 25% of flows so far going to adaptation, and with priorities in national developed contributions overwhelmingly emphasizing adaptation needs, seeds are falling behind, yet have no choice but to adapt to climate change today. Given the current debt sustainability challenges in the Caribbean in particular, it is therefore crucial that we identify and pursue innovative approaches to help scale up public sector investment. This is why the Caribbean Development Bank is advocating that developed countries reallocate just 2% of their latest special drawing rights allocations, which can be combined with the SDRs already allocated to SIDS to enable them to invest in adaptation at scale, despite the significant impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has already had on the public debt levels. Equally, the private sector should play a key role in scaling up private climate finance. We see need for instruments to facilitate the de-risking of investment opportunities for the private sector, which has ample capital. One option is the development of contingent and variable return instruments that can ring-fence future catastrophic events and incentivize the implementation of reforms through the repricing of financing, conditional on the implementation of reforms, including specific adaptation investments. Second, what are the biggest hurdles vulnerable nations face? One, the identification and development of bankable project proposals. We therefore need human and financial resources to support project identification, design, and development, which are of paramount importance. Availability and access to reliable climate data and information to show how projects will respond to climate change rather than climate variability. In other words, means to address gaps in impact-based forecasting. Indeed, we need to measure better to target better. And therefore, CDB is proposing the development of a recovery duration adjuster to provide a resilience-adjusted measure of gross national income as a means to unlocking lower cost and more concessionary finance for environmental resilience. And third, what concrete strategies should the international community pursue? We need first to crowd in the private sector to focus on shared national and regional objectives. To do this, we can work studiously at partial loan guarantees, first loss guarantees, and other regional innovative instruments to de-risk private sector investment opportunities. These could be used to target regional coastal infrastructure, water systems, and building transportation and sustainable energy opportunities that are vital to our social and economic development and well-being. Second, we need to adopt clear and concrete policy guidance for and improve delivery of programmatic approaches to climate financing as already pursued by multilateral funds like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And third, to enhance reliability and approval timing of climate finance flows to facilitate the unlocking of additional investment by the public and private sectors. Why do we ask this? Because the ad hoc nature of many climate flows now result in a suboptimal allocation of resources at the program and project levels. In addition, the longer review and approval timelines that we face and vary quite dramatically result in challenges for planned co-financing, sometimes derailing projects and programs altogether. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leon, for your strong words of guidance, what is needed, including bankable projects for adaptation, indeed. Let's move to Susan Morehead of the OECD, the chair of the Development Assistance Committee, DAC. You already reminded us before that how important it is to link adaptation and to mainstreaming into development. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'm delighted to be here today as the chair of the Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, which represents 30 of the world's most generous donors. And amongst other things, we're responsible for the governance of that fantastically precious resource, official development assistance, which was over $160 billion last year. And many of you have mentioned the importance of concessional finance, and ODA, of course, is by definition either granted or lent on very, very favorable terms. We were asked to talk about concrete strategies. Well, I'm delighted that we agreed a few days ago a landmark declaration in the Development Assistance Committee, which sets out a new approach and vision about how we align development cooperation with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think by extension, we need to say here today that it's also to align with the delivery of Glasgow. It's a package deal, and like all package deals, it was a hard-fought compromise. But central to it, and I think with unanimity in the committee, was the recognition that adaptation has long been neglected in development cooperation and in all climate discussions, and that this has got to stop, right here, right now. Sadly, it's too late to imagine that we will reduce poverty or tackle inequality or achieve any of the Sustainable Development Goals without more and more effective finance for adaptation in poor countries. How do we help to rebuild confidence in those partner countries? The first thing is to listen, as we did when we were developing our declaration. I think even more important is to hear the message from developing countries about the urgency of adaptation. For many of the poorest people in the world, the climate crisis is part of daily life, The least developed countries are already facing drought, food insecurity, and increasing conflict over scarce resources. Small island developing states are literally drowning. And these are people who, remember, often don't even have access to electricity. These are women who are having to gather firewood to prepare the family meal. And I don't know if you've ever tried to make a cup of tea or boil an egg on a solar panel. I trust me, it does not work well. So we need to develop technologies that will specifically help poor countries adapt. Think of the power of science that we harnessed to develop the COVID vaccination. When are we going to start harnessing that power to innovate and to help developing countries accelerate their own just transitions to net zero? That's what the DAC has committed to doing. And we're going to use ODA to help do that, to build capacity in partner countries and to support their priorities. Finally, let me just say a word about the biggest hurdles and how to overcome them. The first is, can we please stop making it so hard for least developed countries and SIDS to access those green finance resources that are already available? We need to work across the multilateral system. Reform is urgently needed, and we need the people in this room to get together as shareholders, as stakeholders, and to work out how to do that fast. Second, we need to be more transparent as donors about where the climate finance is going and what for. Our DAC declaration commits to being more transparent in climate finance by the end of 2022, which, trust me, for a multilateral organization, that is at breakneck speed. We need to use official development assistance to help mobilize more private finance, to blend it in creative ways and generate that alchemy that you can get when you use public and private resources together. And last, but by no means least, we must not ignore the development effectiveness principles to make sure that adaptation and transitions to net zero really do work. They need to be country-driven. They need to be results-focused. They need to be based on sound partnerships and accountable and transparent. They need to be inclusive, and they need to make sure that women and girls are at the heart of decision-making and implementation. These are not nice-to-haves. We learnt the hard way that development doesn't work unless it's based on these principles. And adaptation and mitigation will not work either unless they're based on these principles. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is to build on what we know works and to focus not on declarations now, but on delivering the outcomes that they promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for your bold vision indeed. Also, just a little bit of timekeeping. There are lots of ministers here. We want to hear from them all. So I would like to encourage all of you, focus on a short statement, the key ideas, 2 minutes, and then we can get all these colleagues in indeed. But the next one is Ambrose, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And let me first thank the organization of the dialogue and the UK presidency for this invitation. And I'll be actually very quick to explain what such an institution as the European Investment Bank, the EU Climate Bank, can help to address some of the issues here. And actually we'll try to address that by doing more volume and more impact. More volume. Here in Glasgow, EIB has announced a tripling of its adaptation finance by 2025. And for us, it represents a significant increase and an important contribution to accelerating adaptation investments across the world. And second, more impact. We will be able to overcome the structural barriers to investment in adaptation only if we can increase also the impact of our finance. And for that, we will scale up investment for physical capital, natural capital, and human capital. And let me just give a few examples of those three. On physical capital, we will support investment in physical capital, in particular in cities, to help manage floods, to protect critical infrastructure related to water, agriculture, energy, transport and health from more extreme weather. We've done that in Mozambique for the reconstruction and enhanced resilience of the water supply and wastewater infrastructure destroyed by the cyclones 2 years ago. We'll also support higher risk activity associated with innovative products and technology, and we think this is actually what the public bank has to do. For example, we are investing in the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance Technology Transfer Facility, CRAFT, who is the first private sector fund dedicated to invest in growth equity in companies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas that provide data, tech-enabled services, and products to manage the risks and impacts amplified by the climate change. We are going to increase our investments in the resilience of ecosystems that can help protect cities by reducing water runoff, creating natural barriers to flooding, and a reduced extreme heat in the urban environment. Nature is part of the solution. And finally, in terms of human capital, we also need to be smarter and invest in human capital. We are part of the AAAP initiative that is led by the African Development Bank, and that is also your initiative, Patrick, at the Global Center of Adaptation. And we also are implementing the City Climate Finance Gap Fund that is supported by the German and Luxembourg governments. And together with the World Bank, we will help cities across the globe realize their ambitions for both climate resilience and low-carbon development by offering technical and advisory services for early-stage preparation and planning. I will close here, but not without saying a point that Susanna just made, that in our strategy for adaptation, we will pay special attention to the least developed countries and the small island development states that need certainly our support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambrose, for your very strong words, and also committing the EIB for even doing more in the near future. We're going now back to the ministers. We are behind time. I mean, yes, I'm doing not a great job as a moderator. Let me just invite ministers and representatives to come to the stage as follows: United States, Fiji, Colombia, Peru, if you can come to the stage, colleagues, Somalia, Japan, and UAE. If you're here, great. You can just sit whenever you want to sit. Oh, sorry. Okay, no. You're going to be the first, though. So, which also allows me to introduce our next speaker, a person who was instrumental only a few years ago in concluding and getting the Paris Agreement concluded. Jonathan Pershing, Deputy Special Envoy of the United States. Jonathan, you have been a strong advocate for the energy revolution. What is the position now of the United States on adaptation, both at home and how you can support internationally?
So thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to be on the podium on this particular, at this particular event. I think, as all the speakers before me have laid out, the importance of this dialogue cannot be understated. The collective raising of ambition to manage the impacts of climate and to adapt more effectively is absolutely central. I really wanted to highlight only a couple of comments because the time is extremely short. The first is to speak to some of the questions that we've got on the table, and I'd like to start with the issue of trust. It's quite clear that the only way we can rebuild that trust is if we provide resources, in particular to those hit the hardest and have the least capacity to adapt. And to this end, last week when President Biden was here, he announced a major new program, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. It's got a nice acronym. It's called PREPARE. It fits perfectly in the model of what we are trying to do. And he committed to $3 billion a year in adaptation finance for this agenda. I hope that that's a down payment on the kinds of things that we can deliver. But it's good also to think about the specifics. What are the concrete actions coming both to the hurdles and to how we overcome them with explicit steps? We've got programs in transferring knowledge, programs in helping plan and prepare to better adapt, and programs to facilitate additional resources moving into the system. On the knowledge side, we are looking to help all countries deepen their understanding of the risks, the vulnerability, and the solutions. On the plans, we're looking to help elevate and mainstream adaptation across sectors. And on resources, we are looking at bilateral and multilateral funds across the board. And these will be part of specific projects like resilience programs in Life AR, like the CRAFT program for technical assistance for resilience, and like low-income and SIDS programs for the islands and least developed countries. We look forward to our participation and to our engagement with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Also, congratulations for President Biden for his strong leadership on this particular agenda, indeed. Let's move to the next speaker. We have heard from Ministers of Environment, a Minister from Development Cooperation, but it's also vital to get Ministers of Finance and Ministers of Economic Affairs engaged in this debate, indeed. So we have our next speaker, Aya Sayed Kayoum. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. Between 2010 and 2017, the most climate vulnerable countries received less than $20 per person per year in adaptation financing. That underinvestment is deadly. The vast majority, up to 60% of disaster-related deaths, continue to occur in vulnerable countries. That number will rise, potentially exponentially, if the gap between adaptation needs and adaptation financing persists. The rationale for why at least half of climate finance must go towards adaptation is quite clear, as is the importance of that funding being extremely affordable. And of course, developed nations should deliver the finance they pledged to deliver. Irrespective of the failure to mobilize $100 billion by 2020, developed countries must still be focused on ensuring $500 billion in aggregate is deployed in total over the 2020-2025 period. We can rebuild confidence and trust between nations if we act now to prevent those failures from becoming precedent and get to work reshaping and rethinking the international climate financing regime. We have a clear performance indicator, whether or not finance flows to the most climate vulnerable countries. To move both from billions to trillions whilst also improving the quality and effectiveness of adaptation and mitigation focused financing, we need to create greater credibility through increased predictability under the Paris Agreement. Furthermore, income status is of one many-dimensional metrics. It cannot serve as the bedrock of decision-making. The calculus is actually more complex, and the central logic directing climate finance flows should be centered on climate vulnerability. Our world is not one-dimensional, neither are our problems, challenges, and indeed decisions. Finally, we must dispel the developed world's loss and damage taboo. We cannot adapt ecosystems that have already been irreversibly altered or retrofit communities that are already in the age of uninhabitability. High emitters cannot have their cake and eat it too if we are to restore trust, regain confidence, and reinstall good faith in light of the gaps and discrepancies that have hindered our efforts to build a safe future. We need dedicated and additional financing to offset the burden of climate impacts that we don't have the ability or opportunity to curtail, mitigate, or dampen. Last but not least, this must go well beyond the rigid, narrow scope of insurance and risk transfer. This needs to be about getting finance to those that have lost what cannot be replaced as a result of this battle. Those who must be given the opportunity that is consistent with basic human rights at the core of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, for your strong words. Indeed, a warm applause. Let's move to our next speaker, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development from Colombia, Carlos Eduardo Correa Escaf. I mean, sir, you already announced last week an ambitious commitment to declare 30% of your territory as protected. What is next for you?
Your Excellencies, good morning, all the audience. So we have been summoned here today to highlight the relevance of adaptation. As Vice Minister of the Environment of Colombia, one of the world's most biodiverse countries, I have to say that the progress on adaptation is paramount to the stability of our nation. And I don't state this lightly. 70% of the water consumed in Colombia comes from our páramos, a unique high mountain ecosystem, highly endangered and vulnerable to climate change, and one that urgently needs financing to develop direly needed adaptation measures. For that reason, President Duque launched the Global Alliance on the Páramos. I could go on naming how vulnerable our country is, but I'm certain that in spite of our huge natural capital, we're not alone, and we get the picture. Minister Mesa was mentioning how hurricanes Eta and Iota heavily damaged not only Central America, but also the Colombian Caribbean. So I'm preaching to the choir, I know that, and I'll spare you the time. So allow me rapidly to address 4 key issues that we request make significant progress on the negotiations held in the surrounding rooms on Glasgow. The first issue is quantity. The most recent reports from Oxfam and the OECD and other independent reports have stated that the maximum level of mobilization of resources has been $80 million. Meeting the pledges of $100 million is the only way to regain confidence. The second issue is quality. The combination of financial instruments used on the mobilization of resources relies heavily on loans, leaving a disproportionate amount on ratio to loans and donations. We need highest need for financing on adaptation. The third issue is proportion, as most climate finance has focused on mitigation, as it was already stated here. And the final issue that I want to address is that resources are necessary to transition to a global economy within 1.5. And we urgently request that at least $70 billion are allocated exclusively to adaptation from here to 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, we have no time to spare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honourable Vice Minister, for also your strong message that we need to use the millions to unlock the billions and then to unlock the trillions indeed. Let's stay in your region. Let's go to Peru. Vice Minister of Strategic Development of Natural Resources, Alfredo Mamani, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, hermanos, hermanas, Hilatanaka, Kulakanak, Waikekuna Panikuna. It's Aboriginal languages. Peru is a highly vulnerable country. We have lost more than 50% of our glaciers during the last 50 years and many ecosystems. Peru has already presented its NDC, where priority action on climate change were identified to achieve carbon neutral and climate resilient development in adaptation. We have identified 92 measures that cover areas such as water, farming, forest, fishing, aquaculture, health. In addition, work is being done to develop measures in tourism and transportation. Furthermore, in June 2020, we approved the National Adaptation Plan, which considers the NBS approach. It's a guiding document for adaptation in Peru for 2030 and 2050. In addition to identifying and document and planning adaptation objectives, public and private, domestic and international financing sources, and adaptation were analyzed. In this complementary manner, we will complete our climate finance strategy this year. This instrument will include estimation of financial needs, strength, resource mobilization, and identify access to financial opportunities for the implementation of NDC, taking into account the particularities and main challenges of the country. Following this experience, we recognize that it's important that climate finance providers and intermediates recognize the initiative aligned to the achievement of the country's NDCs and NEIP and facilitates the implementation of this effort. Adaptation is our priority. Climate change is affecting all of us, nature, population, and goods. Indigenous people and women are our best partnership. We need to act now. We need your support. We can save the planet together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. Honourable Vice Minister, for your strong words indeed, also reminding us how important it is to have the NAPs aligned with domestic financial resources and international financing flows indeed. Let's go back to Africa, Somalia. Minister of Planning and International Cooperation of Somalia, Sir Gamal Hassan. You, of course, you're battling with drought and other challenges. How can we help? Please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to join this distinguished panel discussing adaptation, which for us is central to climate action. Somalia is among the most vulnerable countries to effects of climate change. The climate crisis is one of the main factors undermining social economic stability in Somalia, ultimately impacting our national security. Resource-based conflicts, poverty, and food distress have become constant features in the daily lives of Somalis. And the undeniable fact is that these dilemmas are driven and exacerbated by climate change. Presently, a failure in seasonal rains and devastation of desert logs is causing extensive droughts and severe losses in livestock and crops. This, in turn, will lead to an influx of internally displaced people into urban centers, which in itself is another factor contributing to instability and insecurity. Studies suggest that Somalia contributes less than 0.03% to global greenhouse emissions. But unfortunately, despite being amongst the least contributing countries, this problem, we are feasibly bearing the brunt of its effects. Somalis, just like other people in developing nations, are paying with their lives and livelihoods for a problem not of their making. It is therefore our loud call to the countries with the most historical responsibilities, as well as the countries emitting the most, to start acting on the issues and address the stark injustices of the climate crisis. For Somalia, climate action means adaptation and building resilience, with mitigation as a core benefit arising from adaptation. Adaptation is the priority focus of our country's socio-economic development agenda. In fact, our latest National Development Plan has mainstreamed climate action into the country's long-term development agenda. The updated nationally determined contribution also has adaptation at its core theme. The prioritized adaptation efforts include investment in resilient infrastructure, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, the development of new know-how and reskilling, and the establishment of appropriate institutions, including early warning and information systems. We see a rare opportunity in green transition and investment in renewable energy, which has significant socio-economic potentials that range from creating jobs and increasing access to energy to achieving low-carbon growth and prosperity. Somalia is at a critical junction of its development trajectory. We are at the stage where we are building our institutions and our core infrastructure. And in this process, we are fully committed to a just transition that's based on social dialogue to increase investments in a just and inclusive development process. We firmly believe that the adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy in the pursuit of sustainable development makes it possible to meet long-term climate goals while reaping the full socio-economic benefits along the way. These and other investments are prerequisites to any mitigation efforts for the recurrent humanitarian emergencies and the worsening effects of climate crisis on our country. Our priority adaptation actions require resources and investments far beyond what our country can afford, and the financial flows to support the adaptation actions remain far below expectations. We need scaled up and predictable adaptation funding with commitment to reach equal allocation to adaptation and mitigation as soon as possible. We need to allocate proceeds from market mechanism activities under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement through the adaptation financing in developing countries. We need to agree to a program to improve access to adaptation finance, including by reducing procedural complexities, in particular for vulnerable developing nations like ours. And we need special support to the most vulnerable conflict-affected countries like Somalia. Let us keep the many promises and pledges made and get financing down to where it matters most. As the COVID pandemic has shown us, the problems of the world are interconnected. Let's act together to support Somalia and other conflict-affected countries overcome the climate change problems for the better of all. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Gamal Hassan, Honourable Minister from Somalia, also reminding us how important it is to link the adaptation, mitigation and fragility agenda indeed. And please rest assured that's precisely what the AAAP is intending to do. Let's move to a different part of the world. In fact, let's go to Japan. We have with us the Vice Minister for Global Environmental Affairs, Minister Schroeder, please.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to deliver a speech on behalf of the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. Japan promotes adaptation measures to cope with climate change impacts, such as weather disasters, based on Climate Change Adaptation Act, formulated in 2018. I'm pleased to say that the new National Adaptation Plan, based on the latest scientific evidence, was developed, and its summary was submitted as adaptation communication to the UNFCCC on October 26. Japan is also focusing on improving adaptive capacity around the world. Last week, Prime Minister Kishida announced that for adaptation to climate change, Japan will double our assistance to approximately $14.8 billion, such as in the area of disaster risk reduction. As for the partnership, in 2019, Japan launched the Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Information Platform, or AP-PLAT. This platform is to provide climate risk and scientific knowledge to develop adaptation projects and policy and to offer capacity building. In addition, Japan participates in a couple of initiatives related to adaptation. The Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, or REAP, and the Adaptation Action Coalition, AAC. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to the UK's leadership, which supports this program. Japan will continue to support countries around the world in close collaboration with REAP and AAC by sharing scientific knowledge and best practice on adaptation through AP-PLAT. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Honourable Vice Minister, also for the increase of your climate finance and within that the adaptation component. Let's move now to MENA, to the Middle East and North Africa. We have with us a distinguished, bold leader from the region, Minister of Climate Change and Environment of the United Arab Emirates, Mariam El Mari. Obviously, water is a big challenge for you. What's next?
Wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. As we have already heard from many of the esteemed speakers today, well-directed finance plays a key role in the successful execution of national climate change adaptation programs. And for financing to be efficient, financing should focus on solutions that are naturally available to countries. As we can hear, the rain, Scotland is blessed with a lot of rain. In our country, for example, we don't have rain, but we have a lot of sunshine. So the UAE is keen to leverage nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. As we are a coastal country, believe it or not, we do have forests. We have mangrove forests. And so we want to seek and harness the power of our blue carbon ecosystems, including mangrove forests, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows. Mangrove forests, as you may know, protect our coast from rising sea levels and storm surges and provide critical habitats for biodiversity. They also serve as an effective carbon sink. So the UAE right now is home to 60 million mangroves that form forests spanning 183 square kilometers and capture 43,000 tons of CO2 annually. So to maximize the potential of our nature-based climate solutions, we proactively work to expand our mangrove cover. Last year, we submitted our second NDC that included planting an additional 30 million mangroves by 2030. Now today, I am proud to announce an important enhanced step. We've done a lot of financing in renewable energies to capture the power of our sunlight that we receive 365 days a year. And now we want to strengthen our blue carbon ecosystems even more. So the UAE will now target an additional 70 million mangroves on top of the committed 30 million mangroves, making our new mangrove planting target 100 million by 2030. So, thank you. Thank you. So in doing so, what are we doing? We're going to be expanding our mangrove forest area to 483 square kilometers, and we'll be able to increase the CO2 sequestration rate to nearly 115,000 tons per year. Ladies and gentlemen, making nature our ally must be priority for us. And working closely with the NGOs and the private sector, we will fulfill this commitment to safeguarding the sustainability of our mangrove forests and making nature our partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Minister. This is also a fantastic way of ending this second panel, in this case making blue carbon ecosystems at the heart of the adaptation solution indeed. I want to thank once again all ministers here on stage and government representatives. Thank you so much. Let's turn now to the next segment. If you can go back to your seats indeed. Let's go to the next section indeed on partnerships. We will do the same rhythm. We will have introductory speakers first, and then we will turn to ministers right after. What better person to start the partnership section with than Agnes Kalibata? Obviously, Agnes, we all know Agnes, president of ACRA in Africa, but also she was the chair and the champion on global food systems, which was recently very concluded in September. Agnes, you have the floor. Please, yes, go for it.
Thank you, Patrick, and Excellencies, all protocols observed. Millions of people in Africa and in many places are already undergoing the impact of climate change. We have had the imperative for what we need to do. Today, I'm going to talk to you about effective partnerships and how we can unlock them. And I'll go straight to the point. First of all, we need to build on the work of the Food Systems Summit that has just ended, where 165 countries put forward pathways, which pathways look at planet, food, and economies, and have solutions that bring this for the first time together. We need to take advantage of these partnerships. Second, we need to take action at local level. The 70 million smallholder farmers in Africa that live in farming every day don't want speeches. They want better seed. They want us to partner for that. Let's support the work of the CGIR. Let's support the work of other institutions like AGRA and many other institutions that can take these things to the farmers faster. Let's use public resources, third, to unlock private sector resources. We need to embrace initiatives like the African Development Bank Accelerator Fund that gives us an opportunity to unlock public resources. Let's work together. Let's stop the fragmentation. There's so much fragmentation on the ground, and we are not optimizing each other's efforts. Let's learn from each other. Lastly, we cannot advance on 1.5 degrees if we do not address the challenge of food systems. I hope next year, the COP27 next year in Africa is about food systems, because 65% of Africa's population live in food, benefit from food, and work with food. So I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for your strong words, also for your encouragement to invest more in CGR indeed. Let's go to our next speaker, Angelique Popano, CEO of the Seychelles Climate Change and Adaptation Trust.
Good morning, good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the organizers who have really put adaptation in the place it really deserves. As the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, a conservation trust fund with its origins in a public-private partnerships for the first ever debt for ocean conservation and climate adaptation swap. Such innovations of leveraging public funds to attract philanthropy and private capital is critical for small island developing states like the Seychelles. Because of our characterization as a high-income country, a measure that completely ignores our vulnerabilities to climate and the costs associated with adaptation, we have had to turn and get innovative with partnerships to support our access to finance. For SECAT, partnerships is part of our DNA. As a locally managed independent trust fund, we connect international aspirations to realities on the ground through radical collaboration. One such example is our most recent endeavor to support the government of Seychelles to integrate blue carbon in our nationally determined contributions, leading to the ambitious nature-based solutions commitment. Because nature-based solutions are equally key for adaptation as well. Seychelles has committed to protect 50% of its coastal wetlands by 2025 and 100% by 2030. This initiative brought policymakers, scientists, academics, communications experts, NGOs, financiers, all to bring the importance of coastal wetlands, in particular seagrass, to all Seychellois households. Now, all Seychellois understand the importance of seagrass for our resilience of our fisheries and tourism sectors, for supporting biodiversity, and of course, their carbon stores. Finally, the elements to success are clear: political leadership, inclusivity, meaningful and sustainable partnerships, and finally, sustainable finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelique, for your strong words indeed, and your focus on actions. Let's move to John Haley. John, obviously CEO of the Wills Towers Watson, also very much focused on the action space. Many of the speakers spoke about unleashing the power of the private sector. What can we do?
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to speak about adaptation partnerships. Now, following years of sustained effort, climate resilience and finance are finally experiencing some real breakthroughs. The climate resilience emergency is driving shared realities and mindsets that are helping us adapt faster and at the scale required. We've seen some major announcements in Glasgow from public-private groups, including the Insurance Development Forum and the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, as well as the multi-stakeholder Global Resilience Index Initiative, which is launching as I speak. Back in 2019, at the UN Climate Action Summit, we launched the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, or CCRI. CCRI's mission is to deliver practical solutions for better pricing of physical climate risks in investment decision-making. And CCRI's solutions cover two critical areas of decision-making. The first is national planning, or systemic resilience, and then asset design and structuring. During the last 2 years, we've had an ever-growing coalition of governments, of civil engineers, investors, climate analysts, and rating agencies, all working together to try to crack the code in these areas. And today, we're now in a position where we're launching two important solutions. The first is a national economic prioritization tool in Jamaica. We developed this in partnership with the government of Jamaica, the UK government, the Green Climate Fund, and the University of Oxford. This tool is going to inform national adaptation plans by guiding governments to the most efficient investments. It's going to protect all aspects of national value: social, biodiversity, and economic. And we plan to expand the use of this tool to many other countries over the coming year. Second, we're moving our attention from the regional scale, and we're focusing on the bridge, the road, and the hospital. With collaboration between 27 public, private, and academic institutions, the physical climate risk assessment methodology integrates resilience into cash flows. And besides these two important solutions that we've announced today, CCRI has now initiated its capital piloting phase, which is going to result in CCRI's League of Investment Funds for Resilience. This series of investment solutions will apply CCRI solutions toward resilient investments across critical regions, and it's committed to raising at least US $5 billion by COP27. Here in Scotland, 245 years ago, Adam Smith introduced the invisible hand that shapes the wealth of nations. Now, through system-wide partnerships, we're forging the tools it needs to protect all of us in the climate decades ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and also, John, for your leadership on CCRI and developing, indeed, very concrete tools, such as in Jamaica, and then replicate that into other contexts and other regions as well. We're going now to the last bucket of speakers from ministers and vice ministers, particularly on the partnerships component. I'm taking a little bit of a risk here because we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So I'm inviting the following ministers to stage, but please be as short as you can so we really can live up to that 1 p.m. Drop that deadline. So we're inviting to the stage Sweden, Slovenia, Tuvalu, Namibia, Senegal, Nigeria, Kyrgyzstan. Please, you can join me here on the stage. And I know there are still many more speakers who would like to take the floor as well. So if we have time, we will come to that. If we don't have time, then of course the fault is mine. But let's get to these ministers first and see where we are. So let's go to the first speaker of this panel on partnerships, right? We need to forge partnerships or use existing partnerships to the better. We have a very important speaker with us, Minister for International Development Cooperation from Sweden, Per Olsson Fridge. Please, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, esteemed partners, ladies and gentlemen, COP26 must show that we both understand what is needed to advance the 1.5 goal and that we are willing to do what needs to be done, that we need to move from ambition to accountability. We need to cut emissions drastically, and we need to do it now. Our planet is in a state of emergency. It's a climate crisis, bringing an increased number of storms, floods, wildfires and droughts, a biodiversity crisis with an accelerating extinction of species, raising sharp questions about how our livelihoods depend on our relationship with nature. And as we are destroying our ecosystem services that we depend on, and on top of it, an inequality crisis exacerbated by the socioeconomic effects of the global pandemic, again, disproportionately affecting those who are already most vulnerable. And we know climate change not anymore as a threat of tomorrow, but as the greatest threat we face as humanity today. So we urgently now need to enhance climate change adaptation all over the world, especially in the most vulnerable countries. And therefore, we need to boost adaptation finance to meet the needs on the ground, while also improving quality and ensuring accessibility. It is increasingly important to consider the rapid loss of biological diversity, ecosystem protection and restoration, as well as to prevent that the effects of climate change leads to societal tensions, food insecurity, and ultimately conflict. My government recently announced that we intend to double our climate finance to mitigation and adaptation until 2025. And Sweden's climate aid is roughly equal between adaptation and mitigation. However, globally, climate adaptation is underfinanced. And we, as donors, have to honor the $100 billion commitment. And that's a matter of trust and of accountability. Sweden is also a financial supporter of the GCA's Africa program since its start in 2020, and we intend to continue to support the GCA in Africa. As we are determined to cut our own emissions, to move from pollution to solution, let us work together to enhance climate change adaptation globally, and especially for the communities most vulnerable. Friends and partners, partnership is leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, for your very strong words. Also, not only raising hard questions, but also coming forward with your government for very bold solutions indeed. And thank you for doubling climate finance over the next few years. Let us move now to our next speaker from Slovenia, Andrej Vijak, Minister of the Environment and Spatial Planning. The floor is yours, sir.
Dear Ministers, distinguished delegates, there is a growing awareness that climate mitigation and climate adaptation are two sides of the same coin. We have witnessed a number of extreme weather events also in Europe, confirming that warnings of the last IPCC report. In the beginning of this year, the EU presented a new adaptation strategy with the vision of the Climate Resilience EU by 2050. We believe that stepping up international action and strong multilateral approach is the key. The EU and member states intend to increase support for international climate resilience and will continue to support partner countries to adapt to climate change, including with approaches to avert, minimize and address loss and damage. In addition, the EU has just adopted the EU Adaptation Communication, which showcases a selection of good practices, action and lessons learned. As the EU and its member states are the world's leading donors and we are increasing our contributions, we believe that creating partnerships and implementing facilities is increasingly important to ensure the best use of funds. As adaptation solutions are very country-specific, climate adaptation must be primarily based on the local level and work on measuring progress globally to report during the global stocktake needs further technical work. We must mainstream adaptation action in all sectors and policies and build on the increasing structures, risk management approaches, natural-based solutions, proper spatial planning activities, reducing exposure to climate impacts are important elements in building climate resilience. As a climate leader, the EU will continue to build strong alliances with other countries and promote international actions by sharing good practices, providing support and engaging constructively with all countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister. Also, congratulations for the presidency of the European Union and bringing forward such a bold strategy on behalf of the European Union. And also, thank you for reminding us on the importance of locally led action. Let's go now to Tuvalu, to the Minister of Finance, Steve Panio. We have Tuvalu here? If not, then we go straight to Namibia. Namibia, sir. Minister of Environment, of Tourism, Forestry, Republic of Namibia. Mr. Minister, the floor is yours. Where's the Minister? Oh, Nigeria. Where we have the Minister or not? So I'm adapting in real time. Indeed. The floor is yours, sir.
Director of Proceedings, Your Excellencies, fellow ministers, ladies and gentlemen, adaptation is very critical for a country like Namibia, which is already battling with the impact of climate change, with a global temperature set to surpass the 1.5 degree by year 2030. Climate change models and the latest IPCC reports have predicted that at 1.5 degrees increase, the impact of climate change in Namibia is greater than the global average. This is because Namibia is already stressed from different misfortunes. Notably, I would like to point out some of the impacts of global warming at 1.5 degree in relation to Namibia. That implies annual rainfall will continue to reduce up to 4%, evaporation rate will increase by 10%, cereal and livestock production will reduce by 10%, a number of hot days will increase by 21 per annum. Your Excellencies, these projected climatic events will create a considerable negative social and economic impact. The country's poor and rural populations will be the most vulnerable because they are the most reliant heavily on natural resources. We are therefore calling on negotiators at this COP, and particularly the developed countries, to provide clarity on how they will ensure that a minimum of 100 billion US dollar in climate finance is achieved by 2024. Namibia supports a scale-up financial goal that is based on the needs of developing countries to support the implementation of the NDC in order to reach net zero emission trajectory as soon as possible, while striking a balance of allocation between adaptation and mitigation through significant increase of grant base, not loans burden developing countries. Furthermore, processes to access this finance should remain easier for the developing countries to access. Namibia's NDC, as well as the adaptation communication, are very elaborate on the adaptation interventions that we have set ourselves to achieve. We can only realize these goals if trillions of dollars are channeled to adaptation to implement nature-based climate solutions or the protection, restoration, and improved management of ecosystems that can contribute 37% of the required emissions reduction needed to reach Paris Agreement targets. Thank you for humble attention.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, also outlining the scale of the challenges, but also looking forward on how we can address this collectively. Let's move now to the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, Republic of Senegal. Honourable Minister, Abdul Karam.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués participants, le Sénégal est honoré de prendre part à ce dialogue ministériel de haut niveau sur l'action en faveur de l'adaptation. Comme vous le savez, l'adaptation aux effets adverses des changements climatiques demeure une priorité des pays en développement et particulièrement les pays africains, les pays les moins avancés et les petits États insulaires. Au Sénégal, le secteur d'activité qui sous-tendent l'économie nationale sont fortement dépendants des ressources naturelles. Cette situation rend notre pays particulièrement sensible aux impacts négatifs du réchauffement climatique. Les prévisions climatiques disponibles indiquent que les températures moyennes au Sénégal vont probablement augmenter de 1,8 degrés Celsius d'ici 2035. Les précipitations annuelles vont diminuer. Quant au niveau de la mer, il continuera de monter. Pour notre pays, le pays côtier comme le nôtre, un tel scénario est plein de risques. En effet, l'avancée de la mer provoque une perte d'infrastructures côtières essentielles, une dégradation des terres agricoles et la salinisation des sources d'eau douce qui sont vitales pour les populations. C'est un véritable combat pour notre pays, que notre pays mène sur tous les fronts pour assurer la résilience de notre économie, de nos écosystèmes et sauvegarder les moyens de subsistance de nos populations. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, pour assurer la durabilité de l'action en faveur de l'adaptation, des moyens importants ont été déployés pour intégrer l'adaptation au changement climatique dans le processus de planification du développement économique et social avec l'appui du Fonds d'adaptation et du Fonds des PMA. C'est ainsi que la question de l'adaptation figure aujourd'hui en bonne place dans le plan Sénégal émergent, qui est notre référentiel de politique publique. L'objectif visé est de prendre en charge de façon précoce le risque climatique dans tous les projets de programmes de développement. Je dois aussi préciser que depuis 2015, notre pays s'est engagé dans un processus d'élaboration de plan national d'adaptation avec l'appui des partenaires au développement comme l'Agence française de développement, la coopération allemande, le gouvernement du Québec, l'Union européenne, la Banque mondiale, la Banque africaine de développement et la Banque mondiale. Ce processus de planification et d'adaptation est également accompagné par les mécanismes financiers de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur le changement climatique, le FEM, le Fonds d'adaptation et le Fonds vert climat. Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs, pour asseoir les bases d'une mise en œuvre effective du volet adaptation de sa contribution déterminée au niveau national, le Sénégal doit mobiliser 40 milliards de dollars US d'ici 2030. Pour ce faire, les partenaires et les sources de financement doivent être diversifiées et renforcées. La mobilisation des financements doit aussi s'appuyer sur des approches de partenariat innovants et soutenables pour garantir la disponibilité des ressources à la hauteur des besoins, de la prise en charge adéquate et de l'adaptation, mais aussi des pertes et préjudices liés aux événements climatiques extrêmes dans les pays les plus vulnérables. Pour terminer, pour clore mon propos, je voudrais lancer un appel de renforcement de l'action pour l'adaptation, car je demeure convaincu que c'est à ce prix que nous assurons non seulement la résilience de nos communautés et de nos économies vulnérables, mais également la sauvegarde de la paix dans le monde. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, also for your strong commitment for a deep partnership between your government and Africa and the rest of the world. We did our own analysis leading into Glasgow of the NDCs and NUPs submitted to this particular process. What are the finance needs on an annual basis for adaptation of the 40 African countries who submitted this in the order of 30 billion? African nations like yourself, sir, also indicated that you are really to commit 6 billion out of your own resources. So there is a gap here, but there's also a commitment from African governments to move forward on this agenda because, indeed, it makes economic sense. Let's move now and stay at the continent. In Nigeria, we have the Vice Minister here, Hassan Musa. Please, sir.
Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it gives me great pleasure to stand here before you on behalf of the Federal Minister of Environment, Minister, Federal Republic of Nigeria, Sharon Ikeazu. The search for solutions to impacts of climate change has intensified globally as world leaders continue to take steps towards tackling the effects of climate change. In our vast NDC, Nigeria has made commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 47% conditionally, while also including 2 more sectors, water and waste. The NDC made provision for adaptation actions, which are particularly important for developing countries like Nigeria, who are worst hit by consequences of climate change. Adapting to climate change means taking action to prepare for and adjust to both the current of climate change and predictable impacts in the future. In our course of adaptation, Nigeria has developed the National Adaptation Strategy and Plan of Action on Climate Change. We have also developed the National Adaptation Plan Framework for Nigeria for 2020. Nigeria, like other African countries, are worst hit by impacts of climate change, in which calls for urgent action. We request international partners and developing countries make more funding, not only by promise, but by releases. because it's now very difficult to get these funds. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we appreciate those who have put together this dialogue aimed at improving adaptation action globally. Indeed, this is conversation long overdue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honourable Vice Minister, for your strong words. So I'm looking at the time. There are many, many speakers who have asked and are asking and want to come to the stage, and I really appreciate that. We have limited time, around 25 minutes max. So what I would like to encourage is those who are speaking, make your point quick, fast, and bold. That's what we would like to do in the remaining 25 minutes, so we can end with a big bang, so to say. For the big bang moment, I would like to invite the Special Envoy of Chile, Andres Landerech. Please.
Dear Ministers, colleagues and friends, climate change is the most severe challenge that humanity will face this century. Fighting it urgently is a global ethical imperative. And this is a fight on two fronts, through mitigation by decarbonizing our economies, but just as importantly, by adapting our economies to our changing climate by building resilience to the extreme weather events that are already disrupting livelihoods around the world. In Latin America, we know this very well as a region of particular vulnerability. Adaptation is no longer optional, but unavoidable. However, the adaptation implementation gap is significant at a global scale, and particularly in developing countries, as the impact of climate change increases. Climate change exacerbates the severity of water crisis with serious implications for human health and economic security. If the world continues its current path, projections suggest that we may face 40% shortfall in water availability by 2030. Chile is no stranger to water insecurity. The north and central regions of our country are now experiencing 12 years of drought with severe impacts for agriculture and livelihood. And this is why adaptation and resilience represent a central component on Chile's climate agenda. This is why Cop25 Chile organized the first ministerial dialogue on adaptation, highlighting the urgency of this theme, especially for developing countries with capacity limitations to sufficiently safeguard their territories and most vulnerable populations. In this context, Chile warmly welcomes the Cop26 high-level ministerial dialogue on adaptation action. As its title suggests, now is the time for concrete and ambitious action on adaptation. This means presenting adaptation communication to the UNFCCC and adapting and enhancing national adaptation plans, which many countries like Chile have already committed to do this year. It means incorporating a strong focus on adaptation in the global recovery from COVID-19, prioritizing measures such as nature-based solutions, habitat restoration, and coastal defense, which create thousands of quality jobs while protecting our economies from future harm. And it means enhancing financial flows to support adaptation from the private and public sector. This approach can offer powerful win-win opportunities to build resilient societies while protecting socioeconomic development in the long term. It is time for the international community to react decisively to the scale of the challenge. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres, indeed, also for being so strongly forward-leaning in terms of putting forward an adaptation ministerial last time around. I'm sure also on behalf of Anne-Marie, we're delighted to build on that legacy indeed. Secondly, also reminding us that building on the COVID recovery, it's vital that we also invest in green, clean recovery measures, which is good for the health, economy, and our climate indeed. Let's go to another part of the world, Maldives. Maldives, we have with us the Special Envoy, Sabra Nordin, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Maldives is often cited as an example of one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of the climate crisis. As a small island state, these vulnerabilities are inherent. For centuries, our coral reefs have protected our shorelines and laid the foundation for our livelihoods. But now we live in a 1.2-degree world, where our coral reefs cannot adapt to the pace and intensity of global heating. The reality is that the Maldives and other small island states and vulnerable countries do not have the fiscal space to address both our immediate and long-term adaptation goals. but circumstances mean that we often must turn to our strained domestic budgets to do so. Our main challenge is the fact that resources that were pledged for adaptation, such as the $100 billion every year by 2020, have not materialized. We acknowledge that progress is being made, but when the world raised trillions as a response to COVID-19 in 18 months, we question the pace and commitment for climate financing, and specifically for adaptation. We ask that these processes are aligned with the urgency that is required for adaptation in our countries. We know that it is easier to attract partnerships on mitigation. It is seen as more profitable, but we would argue otherwise. Partnering and investing in adaptation now can prevent extensive loss and damage in the future. The Maldives appreciates the efforts by developing countries to increase their financial commitments for adaptation and are encouraged by the increasing interest expressed by partners to collaborate on adaptation. We are well known for our beautiful beaches and coral reefs, but we also have in place adaptation programs that incorporate local knowledge on adaptation that we can share with others. We welcome partnerships that will allow us to expand our local capacity and increase our resilience. We need partnerships to help us stop the shifting baselines of wonder in our ocean. This includes monitoring over 70 protected areas, finding innovative ways to protect our shorelines, and restoring our coral reefs and breakwaters. We need both immediate adaptation measures and longer-term nature-based solutions. I'd like to conclude by noting that there are limits to adaptation, and that these limits become more entrenched the longer we let emissions rise. We have 98 months to halve emissions in order for the Maldives to have a realistic chance of survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these strong words. There are limits to adaptation, but adapt we must. Let's move now to Vice Minister from, I'm thinking Kyrgyzstan right now. Vice Minister, please, the floor is yours. Ibramov.
Dear Excellencies, dear delegates, first let me thank the organizers for inviting and hosting the Cop26. It is difficult to overestimate the significance of this conference when practically all countries of the world are subject to climate change and its negative consequences. The President of our country, His Excellency Mr. Sadir Japarov, has already announced during the high-level Leaders Summit that for the Kyrgyz Republic, a mountainous country in the heart of the Eurasian continent, climate change is a problem of today and disaster in the near future. Kyrgyzstan, the first among the Central Asian countries, under the coordination of the Minister of Natural Resource Ecology and Technical Supervision, Ms. Dinara Kutmanova, updated its NDC. According to the updated NDC, the overall mitigation goal of the Kyrgyz Republic as a contribution to achieving the goal of the Paris Agreement is defined as 44% by 2030, subject to international support, and by 2050 we intend to achieve carbon neutrality. The total cost of adaptation and mitigation measures is estimated at $10 billion, of which 63% is a need for an international support. As a country with greenhouse gas emissions more than 3 times lower than the world average and GDP per capita of about $1,200, without having a large anthropogenic impact on the climate, is already facing the negative effects of climate change. Dear delegates, today the centuries-old mountain glaciers and biodiversity of Kyrgyzstan are under the threat of extinction. There is a decrease in water resources, an increase in the number of extreme events and the intensity of natural disasters. Over the past 20 years, the country as a whole has seen an increase in the number of avalanches, mud flows and floods by 60%. As a result, the population, economy and infrastructure of the country are seriously damaged, energy and food security risks are increasing, creating serious obstacles to sustainable development, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Realizing the crucial importance of glaciers and accepting responsibility before future generations, we urge to save glaciers for anthropogenic and technogenic destruction, as it happened with the Davidov and Lisi glaciers at the Kumtur mine. At the same time, our country has significant opportunities for expanding the use of renewable energy sources. For example, the country's hydropower potential is used by no more than 10% now. Today, we are ready to cooperate with international funds and development partners on the construction of new hydroelectric power plants and ensuring energy security. In this regard, Kyrgyzstan pays importance to the issues of adaptation and increasing resilience to climate change. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the time has come to make decisions and take actions, and only joint actions can save us from a global catastrophe. We call on everyone to take responsibility for the past, present, and future of our planet. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Honourable Vice Minister. Indeed, also it's very important to get the voice from Central Asia in this ministerial dialogue. What better way to conclude the ministerial dialogue than turn to my good friend from Kenya, Minister Chibuku. We met the week before last in Nairobi, and you told me when it rains, Africa cries. And when it doesn't rain, Africa cries because of the drought. So what's the solution? Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. And first of all, I apologize. I've come in late. We had to attend the stock-taking plenary. Really, I don't have a speech, but let me just say a few things. One, on 31st and 1st, our leaders stood on this podium, and they made statements with profound, very strong messaging. I just want to, with your permission, read a few of them, because I think that really those statements should provide us with the direction we should be taking in this conference. Now, some of these read, "We fail or succeed as one." That's what one leader said. Where Paris promised, Glasgow delivers. Another leader said, "COP26 is our last hope. We must make COP26 a resounding success." Another one said, "We have the science, we have the knowledge, we have the means, and we agree on the urgency. The long wait is over. The world is watching. Now is the day. Now is the hour." Those were very, very reassuring statements from our leaders. Unfortunately, what we have been witnessing in the last couple of days in the negotiations, subsidiary bodies don't seem to match these very promising statements from our leaders. Now we have reports submitted to us as ministers by the subsidiary bodies. The indications are that these statements from our leaders don't seem to have been taken seriously. Yes, Patrick, I told you, and it's truth, that in Africa, it's an emergency we cry when it rains. It's an emergency we cry when it doesn't. Perpetual state of emergency. For us, this distinction between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage is a distinction without a difference. For us, those three are three sides of the same coin. You ask me what is to be done? We know what is to be done. Everyone knows what is to be done. Let's act. There's been too much and too many workshops, retreats, and conferences. And it is always, the time is now, the time has come. Actually, there's no more time. Let's put the money on the table. That is a solution. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, for your strong words. I also I'm noticing that my dear friend, Minister from DRC, Vice Premier on Environment, just arrived. Perfect timing, it's not too late, it's not too early, it's exactly when you need to speak. So why don't we end with a big bang from the Minister from DRC. Please, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur Patrick, CEO d'Adaptation. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers ministres, chers collègues, je n'ai pas un discours magistral à faire, mais je voudrais donner ici la position de mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo, par rapport à la lutte contre les changements climatiques, en me reposant sur le programme d'adaptation. Que signifie adaptation pour la République démocratique du Congo dans le cadre de lutte contre les changements climatiques? Il s'agit bien entendu de nous adapter à la nouvelle donne de réchauffement climatique, ce qui va nous permettre non seulement d'avoir la force résiliente de faire face à ces enjeux du climat, mais aussi et surtout contribuer à atteindre l'objectif que nous nous sommes assignés de maintenir la température planétaire à 1,5 degré Celsius, car cela va de la vie de toute l'humanité. Pour ce faire, mon pays, au sein du bassin du Congo, la République démocratique du Congo se présente à l'humanité comme étant un pays solution. La solution naturelle que nous recherchons, il s'agit du potentiel forestier que nous mettons à la disposition de l'humanité. Tout le monde le sait certainement, je voudrais juste rappeler que le bassin du Congo signifie 268 millions d'hectares de forêts tropicales humides dont l'humanité a besoin pour avoir la capacité nécessaire de séquestrer la pollution, nous appelons les COD, les gaz à effet de serre et autres. La République démocratique du Congo, c'est aussi 10% des réserves mondiales des eaux douces, 52% des eaux douces en Afrique, avec un fleuve qui a un débit puissant, capable de nous donner l'énergie hydroélectrique qui, la desserte, nous permettra de ne plus faire pression à la forêt que nous tenons absolument à préserver. L'adaptation pour nous signifie aussi la République démocratique du Congo met à la disposition de l'humanité ces minéraux stratégiques, le cobalt, le lithium, l'acier, le coltan, pour réussir la transition écologique. Et pour nous adapter à cela, il nous faudrait que ces minéraux soient non seulement exploités, mis à la disposition de l'humanité, mais transformés localement pour permettre aussi au peuple congolais, au peuple africain d'accéder à un coût abordable de les instruments, l'outil de la transition écologique. Enfin, l'adaptation, c'est que désormais en République démocratique du Congo, dans le bassin du Congo, nous avons changé notre comportement. Nous devons le changer, nous sommes en train de le changer, ne plus cultiver de manière itinérante sur brûlis. Alors, il nous faut une compensation, il nous faut de l'échange. Quelle est l'alternative pour que nous puissions nous adapter à la nouvelle culture industrialisée, sans pollution? Il s'agit d'avoir accès aux fonds d'adaptation, accès aux fonds mis à la disposition pour l'atténuation. Il s'agit aussi que nous puissions bénéficier du prix unique, identitaire et équitable du prix de la tonne de carbone. Parce qu'il est inconcevable que nous qui possédons la solution, les forêts tropicales humides nécessaires, notre tonne de carbone puisse être vendue à 5 $ américains, alors qu'ailleurs, la même tonne vaut de 60 à 100 dollars américains. Il s'agit aussi qu'on puisse avoir des fonds additionnels, ne pas nous demander que le prix de la vente du crédit carbone, nous puissions encore ponctionner des pourcentages à mettre dans le fonds d'adaptation. Ce n'est pas possible. C'est-à-dire, nous sommes victimes de la pollution, nous devons trouver des solutions nous-mêmes. Il n'y a pas de logique. C'est pourquoi je voudrais en appeler aux États du monde, dont les dirigeants sont ici. Chers collègues ministres, l'union fait la force. Par principe d'interdépendance entre les États, nous devons absolument avoir le même langage, pas seulement au niveau d'Afrique, mais l'humanité tout entière avoir le même langage dans le cadre de la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Minister Bazaibi, for your very passionate plea, a call for action, but also reminding us, a country such as yours in DSC, you're not waiting, you're moving, but you're reaching out your hand to development partners to work with you, including on adaptation, but not limited to it. This brings us to an end of this, I think, very inspiring ministerial dialogue. And before I just conclude the meeting, I would like to bring up Anne-Marie again to the lectern, just to share some reflections on behalf of the UK presidency. Anne-Marie, please.
On behalf of the Cop26 presidency, I'd like to offer my heartfelt thanks to everyone who's participated in this morning's really rich discussion. May I also thank Patrick particularly for his energy, his enthusiasm and indeed his adaptability as our moderator and co-chair. Today we have heard passion and urgency from voices from across the world. The message is loud and clear. There is an imperative to act on adaptation, loss and damage. The most vulnerable are being affected right now. However, I think we should be encouraged by the progress that we are making. Today we have heard inspiring stories and examples of innovative, locally led action. We have seen new adaptation plans published. We have heard new announcements for more adaptation finance and commitments for more ambition and collaboration, especially for the most vulnerable, such as women and girls. We are turning words into action, but we do have much further to go. The COP26 presidency will continue to champion this important agenda beyond Glasgow. We are committed to closing the adaptation gap. So we will work closely with the incoming COP27 presidency, the African COP, that will put adaptation, loss and damage front and centre. And we will continue to work with all of our partners and through our coalitions to drive this agenda forwards. So thank you all for your time and commitment, and we look forward to the road ahead together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Also a big hand of applause for the UK presidency, for your leadership, Anne-Marie, for Vijay Vel, Mark, Deirdre and others for really pulling this very important ministerial dialogue together. So let me try to conclude this meeting rapidly. The impacts of climate change are at our doorsteps today. Thousands of lives are lost today and millions are impacted today. We have heard ministers here on stage and other panels before. Finance flows and adaptations are not sufficient yet, but we are increasing our ambition in that regard. I think this also has been a very exciting meeting full of new commitments, including from those here on stage with me right now. So thank you, honourable ministers. Based on today's commitment, my impression is adaptation action across the globe is unstoppable. We've heard very significant announcements last week. We hear now very significant announcements today. So I would like to take the liberty to closing the meeting by using the words of my fellow countrywoman. The Olympics last summer, the Dutch athlete Sifan Hassan, originally from Eastern Africa, she ran 3 epic races. The 1,500 meters, the 5,000 meters, and the 10,000 meter. And for the first time, a person, in this case a woman, won 2 golds and 1 bronze medal. From Eastern Africa, now a Dutch citizen. So before these epic races, she was interviewed and said, well, what do you think? What's going to happen? And she said, It's going to be hard, but hard is not impossible. And that's precisely what it is with our adaptation agenda. It's going to be hard, but hard is not impossible. I want to thank you all for your commitments and your contributions. Let's all do our part. Thank you. The meeting is closed.
May I have